Welcome to another one of my Dr. Sadler Chalk and Talks. This one is focused on some questions and issues that are arising in the first week of my online ethics class this summer. I always have my students find some way, and this way I'm doing it with forums, to raise some of the questions, concerns, confusions that they have regarding ethics early on so that I can begin to address them. Otherwise, they'll linger through the entire semester. And one of the things that I find every single semester, every single class, without fail, not only in my ethics classes, but any classes where we're talking about moral matters, are some issues, some questions and confusions that come about because of not making needed distinctions. One of the things that I think is most important to grasp about not only ethics but philosophy in general, and really anything that involves critical thinking, that is going to involve applying concepts to reality, is that we have to be able to make good distinctions. There's a tendency to engage in far too much abstract, all or nothing, don't look at the particulars kind of thinking. And then when people do look at the particulars, they start getting all bound up and mired in the details, and they can't see how to apply the higher principles to the actual cases. And they wind up stuck in all sorts of questions, confusions, concerns. That leads to all sorts of problems, and oftentimes this just constitutes a roadblock. In a conversation, it can turn into the, well, we don't really know anything kind of thing. It can lead to the kind of relativism that is a go-to for many people as soon as things start getting tough, which we don't want to get into if we actually want to get anything done, thought-wise. And it blocks the road to progress. It really not only blocks the road to progress intellectually for people, but because intellectual life and moral life go hand in hand and are connected up together, it holds people back from fulfilling their potential as human beings. So I understand that's rather grand scale, and we're going to focus on some things that are a little bit more mundane, nitty-gritty at this point, but that's worth keeping in mind. So there's a number of different places or situations in which people need to start learning how to make distinctions. And I've only got 3 of these sort of cases up here, and they overlap to a certain extent, but they all end up being the kinds of things that not only students, but anybody who's really not that experienced with a particular field is likely to do when they start thinking about it, when there's demands placed on them to start thinking about things in a more serious, deep, follow-it-through kind of way. So, what are these? One is asking only about the general as if there's a one-size-fits-all response. So saying, is this X, whatever X happens to be, all this way or none of it? Or do you have some rule that can apply in every single case? Is there some definition? Students are always asking for definitions, and actually not just students, but people in conversation. They're always wanting to have definitions, and they don't realize that definitions are something that we work our way towards, not something that if you're a beginner, you actually want to start with. They can actually trip you up because you think that you understand everything in the definition, or that the definition fits every case equally well, and then when you find out that it doesn't, you're upset. And we start getting to some of these things down here, which I'll talk about in a moment. Another very, very common problem, setting up false dichotomies. Saying, well, look, it's either this or it's this. Which is it? And then you ask the expert, and the expert says, well, it's really a mixture of both. Or, you know, there's a continuum. Or, well, actually it's neither one of those. You've kind of got it wrong. Or, you know, in some cases this, in some cases that, and in some cases something else. And again, the beginner is very likely to take this sort of response and say, oh, wait a second, I just want a straight answer from you. And the expert will say, well, you're asking for something that really you don't have any good grounds to ask for, because the reality that we're dealing with is more complicated. That's why we got to make distinctions. See, distinctions allow us to divide things up and to say, well, look, if you're talking about it this way, then I can give you this answer. But if you're talking about it this way, then I have to give you this kind of answer. And there may be other things that we've left out, and I'll come to talking about, the ins and outs of distinctions in a moment. Here's another third way people often go wrong with this. I see this happening all the time. Blurring together or conflating different issues and positions or even propositions as if they're all the same or equivalent, or one necessarily leads to the other. And in that case, the distinction that you want to make is actually between those positions and say, look, if you're asking this question of me, well, here's an answer to that. But that has nothing to do with the question over here that you're trying to tie together with this. This is a separate question. This is a separate issue. And we have to look at this separate from this one over here. Answering this one may not give you an answer to this one. Answering this one may not give you an answer to this one. So these are things that I see students doing over and over again. I myself have done them plenty of times. Becoming a good critical thinker or doing moral philosophy well is something that requires practice, practice, practice. You have to keep doing it, doing it, doing it. You're going to screw up, but eventually you start to weed away those kind of mistakes, and you start to develop the habit of making good distinctions. And if you look at classic philosophical texts, or even if you look at contemporary analytic philosophy, which tends to be a little bit, removed from classical philosophical approaches to things, what you find people doing is analyzing things along the lines where distinctions can be made and saying, let's look carefully at this. Let's not try to answer this question immediately. Let's see whether there's a lot of different ways of looking at this, and whether once we've actually separated out or classified these ways, whether they lead us to different paths. When you're making a distinction, what you're doing is you're saying things are not the same. That's what it is for them to be distinct from each other. And that can happen within the same thing. So for example, let's look at some of these examples that have come from my students' works. One of the questions that comes up every semester has to do with violence. And it usually comes up in terms of capital punishment, a concrete political issue, but it can come up in a lot of other frameworks as well. Whether it's okay to, if somebody treats you badly, to treat them badly in response, that's analogous to that. Is it okay to use force in self-defense or to protect another person? So, what we want to do is try to avoid asking questions set up like this. Is it ever okay to use violence? Either yes or no. And if we say, well, look, people say that using force against other people is wrong, using violence is wrong, well, it must be wrong entirely across the board. Well, no, that's not the way in which people who are actually working in fields that involve violence, like, say, policing, or people who are theorizing about it, say, Aristotle, for example, thinking about whether it's okay to use force to punish. That's not going to be a very productive way of handling things, because that tends to lead to quandaries like this. Let's use capital punishment as an example. Well, it's not okay for us to put murderers to death, because then we're just murdering them. Well, are you lumping everything into the same category without making needed distinctions at that point? I mean, regardless of how you feel about it, you should think to yourself, are these cases really the same in all relevant respects? Is it the same for a private citizen to use deadly force, kill another private citizen who they had no good justification to kill? Is that exactly the same sort of thing as the state then, after a process of trial and understanding, of course, that trials can be subverted and all that sort of thing, but is that the same thing as after having given somebody a trial and having given them an appeals process, using just the right amount of force to kill them, somebody who actually killed other people. It's not exactly the same, is it? Once you start thinking about it a little bit more concretely. But notice, you have to do that. You have to get away from thinking that it's all one single amorphous, all the, same equal across the board kind of phenomenon, and you have to start making distinctions. Is it okay to use violence against somebody who's using violence against you? The question of self-defense. Well, is that different? Is that a different kind of situation? Is it distinct from somebody who is, say, a sadist and just wants to hurt other people? I would say yes, those are distinct situations. Now, you may end up in the same, answer ultimately and saying, no, it's still wrong all across the board. But until you make those cuts, until you analyze things, you're not going to be able to think through whether these dissimilar cases really do amount to the same thing. Let's look at another one that comes up all the time with students. Many students labor under the assumption that if there are objective standards of right and wrong, they should be immediately clear to everybody. And if they're not immediately clear to everybody, then there are no objective standards of right and wrong. So what would this be? This would be a false dichotomy, wouldn't it? It's saying either there are objective standards of right and wrong and they are immediately intuitive or evident to everybody and therefore everybody would follow them, which we know is not the case, or everybody's just got their own individual perspective and there really is no objective right and wrong. There's just subjective preferences or opinions or experiences or life, pick whatever you like, whatever jargon you like over there. Is that all there is? Could there be other possibilities? Could there be the possibility that maybe there are objective standards of right and wrong, but that it takes a lot of work to be able to actually figure out what they are and to apply them correctly and to make, good judgments in difficult cases? If there's a third possibility, then you've got a false dichotomy. And if you've got a false dichotomy and you stick to that false dichotomy, you are going to find yourself stuck and unable to make any progress. You're probably going to make things difficult for other people too if you're called upon to make any decisions that way. A third one that comes up, which really exemplifies this third type of blurring things together. I realize the case that we just looked at also exemplifies that blurring things together too. Some people will say moral values, opinions about right and wrong, pick whatever you like in that sort of category, experiences, the bases on which we choose to make decisions, these are all individual. Sometimes they'll say things like they're unique to every individual, which is clearly nonsense, right? Because if they were in fact unique to every individual, then there couldn't be any discussion of them whatsoever. Experiences may to some degree be said to be unique, but moral values, no. There's a certain array of them, and you may try to come up with something new, but whatever you pick, guaranteed plenty of other people have picked that particular thing to orient their moral decision making around, and so you're not unique. That's just nonsense that people tell themselves because we live in a culture that wants to preach that to us. Be that as it may, it is true that people do have individual perspectives. That the same person, like Aristotle points out, 2,000 years ago, does not always necessarily think the same things about the same things. Particularly if they don't have good moral character, they're going to be all over the map. So, does that solve the issue of whether morality itself or moral values themselves are all purely subjective? That's a different question, isn't it? It's one thing to say, or to ask the question, do people differ on moral issues? Do they arrive at different moral judgments? Do they begin from different sets of values? Have they had different experiences? That's one set of questions. It's an entirely different animal to say, are moral values purely subjective, or even if we want to go a little bit further, are they just relative to societies or groups or that sort of thing? And if you blur these questions together, if you're not careful in distinguishing them apart from each other and asking for answers separately from them, then when you answer one, you're going to think that you've answered the other one. You're going to think that you've answered both, and that may not be the case. So, why do I bring this up in these particular examples? Because a lot of students come to my classes, and frankly, quite a few people that I enter into conversation with, come to me with the views that everything is just purely, subjective, because they've been misled by faulty reasoning, by not making distinctions. Distinctions are one of the fundamental tools of human thought. If you're not willing to make distinctions, you're not willing to think very far. You're only willing to think in very simplistic, abstract terms. If you want to understand difficult matters, the sort of things that people do disagree about, you have to be prepared to make distinctions and to follow through the different paths and see where they lead to. Now let's look at some of the reasons why people don't make distinctions when they need to be making distinctions in order to think things through. Why does this occur? One reason is because of a lack of information. People simply don't know that there are differentiations that they should be looking at, that not everything is exactly the same. And to a certain extent, people can be held, less responsible for that, provided that the information isn't missing because they decided to disregard it, or because they are sloppy in the way that they handle information. They were given it but didn't pay attention to it. Here would be an example. Most Americans know very little about Islam as a religion, as a sort of culture and civilization spanning centuries. I think most Americans by this point hopefully do know that there's two main divisions within Islam. Sunni Islam, which is the largest, and then Shia Islam. There's others as well, other distinctions that get made. And within each of them, you can find other further distinctions that are being made. Now, let's say that you actually do know, well, okay, there's these two different kinds of Muslims, and they don't like each other necessarily. But that's it. Is that all that you need to know about Islam in order to think things through when it comes to actually dealing with Muslims? Well, why are things different from Muslim country to Muslim country? Why aren't they all exactly the same? Because there are distinctions that are made. For example, there are four main legal schools within Sunni Islam, and they have different ways of looking at the particular issues, of reasoning things out. So if you didn't have that information, you wouldn't know that. Now, once you actually do acquire that information, then you can start making better and better distinctions. You can start thinking things through more carefully. You can start asking the right sorts of questions. And that leads to the second. Oftentimes, people have the habit of stopping short in their research. And this could be because of a lack of curiosity, or a just unwillingness to think things through, or wanting to get things done very, very quickly, or being kind of sloppy. It could actually come from a lack of information about what is research and how much information is there out there, and what ought you to be doing as a human being carrying that sort of stuff out. But very often people will not go further than they feel that they should, or further than they feel that they need to, in order to think about how things split up, how things break down. And so they'll engage in, sort of sloppy, simplistic, abstract thinking, or they'll set up false dichotomies because they don't realize by going further that there are other alternatives, or they'll blur things together because they didn't really think that these are separate issues, when a little bit more research would indicate that to them. Now, a lot of times people don't know where to go. This is another problem. But Again, these two kind of go together, the not researching and the lack of information. They're also consolidated by mental habits. And this is a very important point. As human beings, we are the product of our actions and choices, and those get consolidated into habits. This is not entirely up to us. We are formed to some degree by our environment and the things that other people provide us as models. We don't, it's not as if you can snap your fingers overnight and quit whatever habit it is that you have. But whether it comes to physical actions, like biting one's fingernails, or whether it comes to emotional responses, or ways of thinking, or ways of approaching things, these are matters of habit. And the more that you do something a particular way, the more it's going to seem natural to you, and the more other ways of doing it are going to seem unnatural, or they're going to be totally left out of the picture. So if you get yourself in the habit of doing these sorts of things, and I think unfortunately that the way that we educate a lot of the time tends to produce and reward some of this cognitive behavior on a lot of people's parts, in part because I think educators themselves often don't make good distinctions when they ought to be making them. Because we do this, a lot of people have mental habits that make it difficult for them to not only make distinctions, but to see the need to make distinctions. And what is the result of that? They don't make the distinctions, and then they wind up in all sorts of quandaries, aporias, literally where you can't find your way out. When actually, if you made the right distinctions and then followed them through, you could think your way through something. I think that emotions also fit in with this as well. People often have a very strong desire for things to be simpler than they are. And I can understand that. I fall into that myself from time to time when I oversimplify in my personal life. But it's something that we have to resist. If we want to understand reality, reality is complicated. Even a single human being is very complicated. So when it comes to ethics, why would we possibly think that everything could be reduced to just a simple list of cut and dried answers? People want that sort of thing, but what they're desiring is something that's actually not good for them. That's a starting point, being given a code, but that's not really becoming a thinker who can actually apply ethical or moral principles to real cases and successfully come up with the good moral evaluations and judgments, and then be able to justify them to other people to get them on the same track, or to figure out some of these big issues that keep coming up over and over and over again, which we have to address. So all of these are things that, if you want to think about where you actually stand with this, would be good to focus on. Do you feel like things ought to be simpler than they are? Do you feel a kind of repugnance when being asked to make distinctions? Is that coming about because of emotions, or is that coming about because of mental habits? Have you actually sought out information? When you wind up in some sort of quandary, do you know that it's up to you to go out and look for answers? That the answers are not just going to pop into your head. You may be lucky enough to have some people near you who actually see the problem that you're in and say, oh, I've had this sort of problem myself. But most of the time, as an adult, you actually have to seek out the answers that you need. And making distinctions is going to be an absolutely irreplaceable tool in your arsenal in order to be able to do that. So, if I had to close on anything, I would just say you can't get by without making good distinctions. The more that you practice that, the more that you get used to doing that, the better you're going to be from situation to situation to situation, from subject matter to subject matter to subject matter, because this is an extremely important cognitive skill, not only for ethics, but for anything that you're going to go into. And I'm willing to bet, whatever it is that you're interested in, whatever it is that you're studying, if it's not ethics, you've probably learned how to make distinctions in that area. If you're really interested in cooking, you don't think all spices are the same, right? So you actually make distinctions, and you say, well, this is for this case, this is for this case. Learn how to transfer that skill from one context to the other, and you're putting yourself in really good stead to be able to handle this sort of thing.